Hello again, everyone. This panel has the dubious distinction of being the post-lunch panel. So I hope you all have imbibed some caffeine. Be prepared to elbow your neighbor in that post-prandial dip moment. I'm Emily Cruz. I'm the executive director of the Marty Center, and I will be moderating today's panel. I'm going to innovate a bit or go rogue, depending on how you define it, and change my intro style a bit from the two previous panels. So I'll tell you who these folks are and what questions they're going to address, and then I will sit down and stay sitting down. This panel is entitled Religion's Turns, Tropes, and the Stuff of Life. Its participants are first, Professor Matthew Engelke, professor and chair of the Department of Religion and member of the executive committee of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. Trained as an anthropologist, Professor Engelke's main research interests are on Christianity, secular humanism, media theory, materiality, and semiotics. He has conducted fieldwork in Zimbabwe and in Britain. He is currently working on a book about secularity and death based on research among humanist funeral celebrants in London. Our second participant is Samuel Catlin, Shuman visiting assistant professor of Jewish thought at the University of Buffalo. Professor Catlin is I just read the title, there you go. He earned a joint doctorate from the Department of Comparative Literature and the Divinity School at the University of Chicago in 2022. A scholar of American Jewish literature, modern Jewish thought, and biblical and rabbinic receptions, he is currently at work on two books. No overachieving there. A study of Judaic text in the work of major American literary theorists from the 1970s to the 1990s, and a study of the American college campus, part media genealogy and part psychoanalytic critique. His writing for academic and general readers appears in proof texts, parapractice, and elsewhere. The questions that our panelists have been asked to address today are as follows. A shared question for the two: how do you figure the relationship of the linguistic turn, the cultural turn, and the material turn to one another? How does each move inform the others? And then a question for Matthew specifically: how can thinking in terms of affordances rather than concepts change the way we construct arguments? And for Sam, are there ways in which the material turn can productively inform modes of semiotic analysis? And then if we have time, one final addition: what's the role of Marx and Marxian analysis for each of you, should there be a role? We're going to start with Professor Engelke, and then Sam will come up, and then we will talk together.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to Sarah and Tiffany and everyone who's been involved in getting us here. It's really nice to be here. When I was in college, which was here actually, I thought that edited volumes were really cool, and I had this image of everyone in the edited volume being together for an intensive, lengthy period of time and thrashing out their ideas. And while that does happen, it's very rare. And I've been in a lot of edited volumes where I've actually never met the other. there was nothing. I mean, at least in a physical co-present sense. But this is a nice kind of iteration of that. So bringing us together kind of just as it's about to be published. And it's just really nice to have that connection now. So thank you all so much. So my prepared remarks are more, not necessarily to the questions, but we can maybe get to those questions in the Q&A that were asked both of Sam and me, and then also specifically in relation to my paper. But I was also asked to kind of sum up the paper. So my term was matter, and I approached this as a way of engaging primarily with students or at least readers who are not coming from religious studies. And I think that's one of the great, the great benefits of volumes like this. I did write, and maybe, I don't know, for people who have not written a lot or published a lot, I have written another piece. I wrote a piece called Material Religion for the Cambridge companion to religious studies, and that came out in 2012. So I thought, I can do this because I've already done it, but that actually makes it much harder because I had already written an article about material religion, and so I wanted to approach it in a different way, and that was a real challenge to not simply repeat myself, and I hope I didn't, but I did approach it in a slightly different way. But that first article came out in 2012 when I think the material turn, which is something I talk about in the chapter, was much more like right in the, like it was, the turn was still taking place, if you will. And I think by even 2021, when we were writing these, it slowed down maybe a little bit, although it's still rotating. But the main point in the article is a simple one, which is that matter is not only ever incidental to, but constitutive of religion. And as I said, this point was made in part with the new student in mind, for whom, and I did write these comments yesterday before the benefit of the last session, but for whom the emphasis on belief may be too central to the picture, and who may more generally have little background. I actually begin, there's been some discussion today of J.Z. Smith's presence in this volume. I actually begin my chapter with Donald Lopez's wonderful article on belief from the first edition, and talking about the way in which reading it to think about this volume, so Lopez tells this story of Saint Peter of Verona, I think, who is martyred, and there's an image of him writing on the floor, credo in his blood, I believe, and this is what Donald Lopez begins with, that idea of belief, right? And then he goes on to write an article about belief. And it struck me when I was reading this that I was more interested in the blood than in the word that he was writing, at least at that moment in time, right? Like, and of course, there is a lot of work on blood, and it's not all confined to the 21st century by any means, but there has been a really interesting set of works or range of works in the past 20, 25 years that have focused more on the blood than the propositional statements in what is written out in linguistic textual form. So that's the opening image of the article to try to get a sense of this turn to the material. Just as a side note, and this is picking up on some of the points that were raised earlier, I was really glad to hear that in the last session, I think there's been so when you're teaching a class, maybe especially to students who are brand new to religion, it is absolutely my experience that the vast majority of the students want to think about religion in terms of belief, right? That's what happens. But I think there was a really salient point made in the last session that scholars may be overcorrect, because like belief is still kind of like, it's relevant, right? And not only to I study Protestants, so it's like super relevant, but I have heard it's relevant for other people as well. So, it's just, but it's interesting how that, we spend so much of our time as scholars of religion, like bashing belief. So stick up for belief. But there's a great story of an anthropologist, Max Gluckman, who was working in Southern Africa. And I'm sure the story's not true, but doesn't matter, does it? But he's I think it's with the Lotse, or maybe it's the Baratse, I can't remember. Also doesn't matter. And he asked this guy in the village, like, do you believe in ghosts? Right, wanting to like get super rational. And the guy says, no, but I'm afraid of them. Which, sounds about right to me. But anyway, so this is just a side note to say that while belief does not appear in the second volume, we should keep it around. Anyway, back to the material turn. the particular focus in this material turn has, as I try to show, often focused on the affordances of materiality. And the way that I try to explore this and present it again for students is not by turning to like a big conceptual overview of matter, but to particular case studies. I think case studies are really great to work with, and so much of what we focus on in our work, especially, well, I'm trained as an anthropologist, and the ethnographic stuff often gets downplayed in favor of the theory stuff. And I think it's a shame because there's a lot of great ethnography. And in the chapter, it's actually not 3 ethnographic cases. 2 of them are pretty ethnographic. 1 is historical, but they're case studies, and I wanted to kind of get into case studies. So one is of Caroline Walker Bynum's book, Wonderful Blood. Another is an essay by the anthropologist Samuel Catlin on Potter priests and Brahmin priests in Tamil Nadu and the ways in which they work with different materials to construct images of the gods. And the third is of Kadri Jain's most recent book on cement statues in India and the particular affordances of cement as a material with which to build statues, which means they can be much, much bigger than they used to be. They're also coming out of the temples into public spaces. So these are 3 texts that I had read and really appreciated, and in the chapter what I really wanted to do was kind of celebrate and focus in on this idea of affordances through the work of these 3 amazing scholars, to kind of highlight their work. I don't know if any of them think of themselves as like, how they would categorize themselves as like theoretical or not, but I wanted to kind of work with that material. And just to give you a sense of a couple of the examples, in Meketessen's work, part of what is so interesting about the study that she presents is how these Potter priests in the villages would traditionally construct images of the gods out of a very nice clay, but that over the past several years, various laws or environmental regulations or restrictions have made it difficult to source that same quality of clay. So they have to rely on a less, not as good clay. I'm not a clay person, so I don't know how you would talk about this, but it's not very good, especially for constructing images of the gods. But this has led some of the priests, the village level priests, to turn to what would be classed as a kind of higher material that the Brahmin priests would use, which is stone. But this has a series of knock-on effects, which are both political and social, between and among classes of priests, like who has the right to use these materials. But also the gods, the village gods, are not particularly happy with the new material because the stone, and this picks up on James's X-ray of that image. They can't. The stone cannot be hollow, or at least it would be much more difficult to hollow it out. So this affects the way in which the god can be present in the image, because clay is very easy to have. Clay would be the clay statues would be hollow, and those statues are filled with smoke and vapors as the presence of the deity. So there are both kind of political and social, but also metaphysical effects, knock-on effects, and reframings that take place as a result of this matter. Another example that I focus on is from Kadri Jain, of these publicly cited statues of gods, and in some cases political figures in Modi's India, which, as I mentioned, are now constructed of cement. and can, as a result, be much larger than they used to be. And as Jane shows, this is reshaping quite literally the sites and scales of piety and practice in India. And I think Jane's first book also, which was on calendar art, could easily have been another case study. But she had just come out with this wonderful book, and I wanted a reason to read it, which is another good reason to write essays maybe outside of your comfort zone. I'll also point out here that two of the case studies that I focus on are really focusing on kind of Hindu case studies, and I know this is not my area, but this is one of the nice things about writing in a volume such as this, that you can kind of step outside of your particular expertise and highlight the work of colleagues working elsewhere. So to me, that was very important. So as I also try to show in the chapter, the work in this material turn is often indebted to, or at least resonant with, the broader work in new materialism, which has been mentioned by such scholars as Bruno Latour and Jane Bennett. I think I mentioned Jane Bennett. I don't think I mentioned Bruno Latour, but they're both very much there, as are others. And while I don't get into this in the chapter, we can also see in it that a materialist semiotics indebted more to Charles Peirce than to Saussure. And this picks up, or at least gestures towards a potential conversation with Sam, because Saussure features prominently in his chapter on text. So, but that emphasis on Peirce is not present it's not explicit in the chapter, but it very much informs it. So this is shaped. This work in the material turn is shaped not only by ideas like distributed agency, but also the affordances of form in semiosis. And so just to round out, I want to read the last paragraph of the piece, since I'm assuming you haven't had a chance to read it yet. So it'll still sound new. And this is just after kind of picking up on Kadri Jain's work. So we can see how Jain's work both is and is not about religion. It is about matter, really, what matter both wants and affords, what it grounds and unsettles, the present and the absent, the high and the low, the natural and the made. At one point, Jain says she is interested in, quote, what people do with icons and what icons do with people, affecting a kind of figure ground reversal or recalibration of the senses. All the work discussed in this chapter reconsiders what counts as the religious in religious studies. Through such a recalibration, it can make sense to say that blood is religion, clay is religion, cement is religion. The turn to matter is a turn away from the subject as such, her beliefs as such, the temple as such. Not, mind you, a complete turning away. That's why, again, slow down. But nevertheless, now I'm not reading. Sorry, I'll go back to reading. Not mind you, a complete turning away, but a material turning. Blood, clay, and cement can show how the qualities of things, the per se stuffness, and that phrase per se stuffness or thingness comes from Caroline Walker Bynum in her study of blood hosts, hosts with blood in northern Germany in her book Wonderful Blood. Such things are not, so that blood, clay, and cement can show how the qualities of things, their per se stuffness, are not incidental to theological or religious perspectives and practices. Such things are both objects and subjects, yet also never fully captured in binary terms. And here we go back to this morning, I guess. When we consider blood's elemental qualities linger in the potter's shed and account for the engineering potentials of cement, the sensibility and framing of the study of religion shifts in marked ways. So that's it for now. I will return to the questions when we get to the Q&A about more about affordances, and I'll say a little bit about Marx as well.
Sorry, my talk is dispersed among 2 Word documents and 2 non-consecutive sheets of paper. So, and a marginal comment in this book. So I'm like, we'll see how this goes.
Sam's term was text, just so you...
In the singular, though, now I'm in the plural. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to be in this volume. It was a great honor and extremely nerve-wracking. But I'm really pleased not only with how mine turned out, but how the whole volume turned out. I mean, we got PDFs of it a little bit in advance of you all, and I had the great pleasure of getting to read all of the chapters beforehand and seeing how they all work together so beautifully as a picture of the field at its current moment. And then the talks have already sort of shaken that up, like shaken up the impression that you get from reading it. It's already like new things are being added. There's been a couple of comments about the first edition, which I'm holding. Again, a text, a material text though. The relation between the new edition and the first edition is kind of different from chapter to chapter. Some of the chapters really are sort of independent entirely, except in the sense that they're written in a field that's been defined by this edition to some extent. Others are really directly engaging predecessor chapters. Like we've heard, image is the only word that appears in the singular as a title. Religion does appear, but of course J.Z. Smith's famous essay, It's Not Just Religion. So there's a little bit of that. And then there are also these interesting cases where there's a new term that is not the same as the previous term, but is in some way supplementing it, either to correct it or to expand on it or to update it in some way. So like another one I would point to is in this edition, Daniel Boyarin's chapter on gender is one of the weirdest chapters in this book. It's very strange that that chapter ended up in there. I don't know how that happened. But then now we have Benjamin Dunning's chapter on sex. Sex and gender are obviously not the same thing, but the sex chapter in some ways does a lot of the work that one would have expected a gender chapter to do in 1998. And it's like, so when I was reading the sex chapter, I was reading somebody sort of like, okay, well, I have to catch us up to where we ought to have been in 1998, and then I can go further. And that is also was my experience writing my chapter. So in this edition, David Tracy wrote the chapter on writing, and my term is text. I was not given the term. I was given some options. I chose text for reasons I'll explain in a second. But it was like a constellation. Sarah emailed me and was like, you want to do writing, word, sign, text. And I chose text because it seemed to me, well, actually, let me tell you about writing first. I have used this volume a lot. This is my copy. It's fine as broken on the title page of Religion, Religions, Religious, of course, because I teach that a lot. So I used chapters from that volume. I've read the whole thing. I read it in grad school when I was starting out in religious studies, and some of the chapters really stuck with me and became like guiding documents for me in terms of finding a bibliography. That's one of the things no one's talked about that this volume does, is that we all had to prepare a bibliography of further reading. The process of compiling that was really exciting for me. Some chapters helped me find other material. Others just are incredibly good analyses of their term that I just cite as authoritative. Tomoko Masuzawa's chapter on culture is like, to me, just like the last word on culture. It's really brilliant. I would have to say, despite the fact that I write on text and textuality all the time, I have never once thought about David Tracy's chapter on writing. Many great works by David Tracy in the world. I wouldn't say this is one of them. It, in fact, really says almost nothing of use that I could find. I went back and reread it, and I was so startled that it just seemed to like not do any part of the assignment of the book. It has these gestures towards things that one might do with the term writing, and then it doesn't do any of them, and does give you a kind of exposition of very well-trammeled territory in Christian theology. You learn a lot about what kerygma means, but not really a lot about why you would even need to know what writing is as a critical term, rather than just an empirical phenomenon that you encounter in the world, writing. There's this one moment in it, at the very end, he says, first, the new theoretical emphasis on the materiality of writing, he's thinking here of semiotics, has allowed for the development of additional critical skills for unmasking the silences, the power conflicts, and the repressions embedded in the materiality of writing. Which is true, and it seemed to me that that ought to have been what the chapter was about, but it's not. He doesn't tell you how to do that, and he also doesn't tell you why writing would be the term that would let you do that. So in the sense that the student-centered sense that Matthew was just talking about, I don't really think that this document, whatever its virtues, is something that tells somebody who doesn't know why writing should matter, why writing should matter. So I had my work cut out for me because I was also in this position of feeling that the chapter that had been produced in 1998 did not assess the work that writing does for religious studies in 1998 or leading up to it. It just doesn't do any of that. So I had to do all of that and then maybe gesture towards some other directions. So most of what my chapter does then, now I'll get to why I chose text as the term from the options I was given, was to think about myself as a student, I've heard a couple of people sort of think about what they would have liked to read or what they would like to teach. The word text is everywhere in humanities scholarship, beginning mostly around 1979, and especially beginning in earnest at the end of the 80s. And then it becomes kind of ubiquitous. You could not open most journals in the humanities without finding the word text used, not just used, but used in contexts that if you are not specialized in the theoretical apparatus of the humanities at the time, you just would not know why things were being called text. What do you mean that a building is a text? What do you mean that a symphony is a text? This is just not an action, a performance, a ritual. These are not texts. I know what a text is. It's a written thing. And it seemed to me that, it was to me very confusing when I was in college to encounter text used that way. And so I chose text because I thought that it was the term that needed the most situating for undergraduates. And I did think of them as my number one audience, the people who I hope to help the most with the essay. So the question becomes, why are people calling things texts that aren't texts? And I walk through the history of that term text, and I isolate sort of three phases that I think of as important. The first is the philological text, which is just the written thing. There's obviously more one could say about philology, but when philologists talk about text, they're talking about things that are written. So that's like your sort of starting level. That's what everyone agrees upon is a text. If you're having a conversation and you use text in the specialized sense, and someone says, what are you talking about? They are making internal reference back to the philological text. And that's a really important kind of text for the history of religious studies. Religious studies as a distinct field emerges in part through a critique of biblical revelation that is staged precisely on the ground of text. By calling the biblical text a text, you put it into, you situate it on a field that is a field already populated by other written things, written by humans, and you can start to do certain kinds of operations on it that you weren't allowed to do when it wasn't a text, when it was a revelation. I'm not going to go through the whole essay in detail. I'm just going to sort of tell you what the other two steps are. I basically think the philological text is dominant until Saussure, until semiotics breaks open an idea of textuality. This would be the next move, what I call in the essay the semiotic text, which is no longer a written thing, but rather writing in general, which is the way that David Tracy's using writing in his chapter in the first edition. He just doesn't explain why he's doing that. But writing in general, which is to say, the fact that signs have to be repeated in order to be comprehended and communicated. So the way that repetition and difference structure all of thought and communication, that's what's falling under this general inflated sense of writing. The person who accomplishes that inflation is Jacques Derrida. So the second part of the essay goes from Saussure through Derrida's critique of phenomenology and critique of Saussure, and that deposits you at the point when people start calling lots of things texts that aren't texts. But the really important move I wanted to make in the essay was to then stop working with the kind of material that people expected me to be working on, the Bible, Derrida, two things that I've written about before, and instead show how once Derrida accomplishes that inflation of text, such that anything that's comprehended through a grid of repetition can be called a text, once you have people calling buildings texts, rituals texts, it gets taken up outside of the philological text's normal disciplinary domain. So I went to anthropology of religions, which I tend to think of, which I think we all tend to think of as a place that's often not that textually focused, although of course anthropology is in fact a discourse that produces many written texts. It has a whole theoretical apparatus, but because of ethnography, it has this sort of like place that it touches the real, we imagine, or we did imagine until text came along, right? So I looked at Clifford Geertz's essay Thick Description, where he explicitly compares the work of the ethnographer to the work of the literary critic, an interpretation that's recorded and thus interpreted again, and then the interpretation is interpreted and reinterpreted, a succession of texts getting interpreted. Actually, ethnography is not the real thing. It's text upon text upon text upon text. And then I finished with Talal Asad, who I think maybe we could talk, Matthew and I could talk more about Assad's place in all of this, because I think that's an interesting point in this genealogy. But Assad's critique of Geertz charges Geertz with having failed to appreciate, it's not that Assad refutes textuality's importance, but that for Assad what matters is how texts get deployed in a social field. So you do need to know what a text is in order to talk that way, but then you should be looking at how texts are used and what they do, and how power relations, for example, are structured by their deployment, not by the text itself, but who is using the text in a real material context and what effects does it have. Which I think does catch us up to about 1998. And I'm gonna leave off there. I had some remarks in the chapter about like the future, but I don't think they're very interesting, honestly. I think the more useful thing is to think about, I want to address this question of turns before I finish. That is about the future, but it's not what I wrote in my chapter, so I'm going to say something different than what I wrote in the chapter. This is the part that's dismembered on my pad of paper here. It's on one of these. There it is. Got it. Okay, so turns.
Good.
I use the word turn a lot in the chapter, not in the way that we've been using it to talk about developments in the field. I use it as an image. I do use it once, and I regret using it to talk about development in the field. I would say, to respond explicitly to the question, that my relationship to these turns is I do not think that turn is I think turn is a problematic term to use to talk about how fields change and develop. So my relation to things like the material turn, I'm not really hostile to the content of the scholarship that happens under that heading, but I'm very hostile to the narration of the development of the field as a series of turns. I have a couple of problems with it, and I'm just going to isolate two of them for you here, and then we'll stop talking. The first is that when we talk about, the first is this issue of the linguistic turn, which I have to say only really encounter this in religious studies, but the linguistic turn refers in its technical sense to analytic philosophy, to philosophy between Frege and Wittgenstein, and the insertion of language, the assertion that language is like the master problem for all of philosophy, that all philosophical problems are ultimately to be settled as problems of linguistic misunderstanding. This is where analytic philosophy in its mature sense comes from, and this is what was called the linguistic turn. At some point, the term escaped containment and began to be applied to a great many other things as well. The problem with this is that it imposes a narrative structure on the development of a field. When you talk about something being a turn, you're narrating events in time. We turned this way, and then we turned that way. And that I just don't think is true in terms of how a field develops. I don't think, first, who's turning? When we talk about the turn, who's turning? In the linguistic turn in its proper sense that I just named, Frege basically turned, right? One guy was like, we all have to turn. And that is really a rare instance where one person can kind of exert that sort of force. And Wittgenstein then, I think, again. But when we say that there was a cultural turn in the 90s, and then there was a material turn now, what gets occluded by that gesture is the fact that a bunch of people have to make decisions about where institutional and disciplinary resources get allocated in order for there to be a turn, right? There are turns because there are conferences, there are conference panels, graduate students are accepted and others are rejected, hires are made and others are not made, job ads are written in particular ways that prioritize what are perceived to be new up-and-coming turns. As one of the more junior people in this volume, I've probably read more job ads than most of the other people in the volume recently. And I have to say, turns come up a lot in job ads. I read a lot of job ads that ask for people who are working on the affective turn, which again, I don't think is a thing. I think affect is a thing that's worth thinking about. I don't think there's a turn until you start hiring people to work on an affective turn, and then suddenly whole institutions are devoted to talking about this thing, and it becomes a phenomenon. So I guess what I'm saying to conclude is that this way of narrating how a field develops is what I have a problem with, because I think what it occludes is that what we're really talking about is competition. That we have finite resources, and we cannot allocate them everywhere, and so we allocate them based on what we think is new and exciting, what we think is going to be the next big thing, what we think is going to be the future of the study of religion, say. And other things end up seeming old, outdated, passé, beyond our concern. I find myself in this position a lot because I work on things that went out of fashion in 1998. But I don't think that they were exhausted in 1998. I think that hiring stopped happening in those fields in 1998. I think when hiring stopped happening in those fields, graduate students stopped learning in those fields in 1998. I don't know that I think that it was great that everyone had to read so much continental philosophy in the 90s, but I think it's a little bit of a shame that so few do now. So if we stopped narrating what's happening as turns, instead started narrating it as allocation, I think a different picture of how a field changes and develops over time might emerge. And this is my sly way of getting at the question of what does my work have to do with Marx and Marxian thought, which is, as I hope is clear from that remark, almost everything, but not head on. I think we all need to be a little bit more concerned with the political economy of the discipline. If it's going to have a future at all, it should be a future where we're not pitting a linguistic turn against a cultural turn against a material turn, but where we hire people who are doing all of those things, where we get the resources to hire people who do all of those things, where we can stop having to narrate a turn and then another turn and another turn. So I don't think it's text versus matter or Saussure versus Peirce. I think it's like everybody should be able to do everything. That's my pitch for the future of religious studies. And that's what I have to say about turns. Thank you.
So that was, thank you. Since I didn't respond to the questions in my remarks, I'll say a little more, but it's great to hear Sam's remarks. I mean, I think for me, the turns in relation to one another, I guess I would like be with you most of the way. Like I find the, turns are, artificial and prepackaged into.
You say that in your chapter. You're
Yeah.
like, I guess we'll call it a material.
Yeah. But then, like, I kind of, I say that, but I also kind of like I have a perverse like of using it anyway. Like, I mean, because I was, oh God, I can't just say that this is a turn because that's ridiculous. Like, because you say, like, it's too overdetermined. But then I kind of have a guilty pleasure in still using them. I don't, I mean, maybe because I'm not sure how we get around that problem of a package. I think allocations could very easily be appropriated into something kind of bad and not illuminating.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't,
I don't think we should talk. I don't think replacing it with the material allocation does much.
That would be, it would be, it'd be interesting to start to see job ads with allocations in the ad. But yeah, no, I think it's, and it gets to one of the challenges of writing in volumes like this. Maybe especially, I mean, I have tenure. I don't care. Like you like, I mean, no, but there are stages in one's career when you can write things, or at least write things with greater ease than others. And maybe like as a junior scholar, it's maybe more tricky. I think I wouldn't have written in some of the ways that I do now, but when I, before I got tenure, which isn't to say you're going to be in trouble for writing this stuff, but like I do think it's interesting to think about the ways in which concepts are problematized or framings are problematized. I don't know, the further I get into kind of writing and thinking, I don't mind circumscribing a fair bit. I just, but anyway, that it's just a thought on the turn. But you're absolutely right. I do in the piece kind of point to, I think, some really key articles that question these other tones, right? And they're not all, they're not totalizing. Also, I think, the authors that I write about, like, I don't think any of them would be like, yeah, I'm part of the material turn, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think Caroline Walker, or Kaji Jain or Samuel Venkatesan, I don't think that's how they would frame it. But I'm trying to gesture towards, like, in writing for volumes like this, right? You're trying to get that balance between, like, saying something that's digestible for a reader who is new, and that could be an undergraduate student, but really anyone who's kind of new to it. So I enjoy that challenge in this writing. The other things I'll say, like the affordances rather than concepts, I think for me is interesting because I think it picks up on something that I wouldn't have necessarily thought, but that Sam, you pick up on your essay because you talk about Geertz and his invocation of thick description and thin description, and the difference between a blink and a wink, right? That kind of famous example that he gestures to. It actually made me think of some of the points made this morning in relation to Heather Love's work. I mean, not feeling backward, but some of her more recent stuff on kind of surface reading and the work of Stephen Best and Sharon Marcus on surface reading, but also Rita Felsky's work on the limits of critique, which Sarah, did that come up in your introduction? Did you mention Felsky?
Yeah, that's just a lot there.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, but then also, and of course, Latour is part of that, which gets to the material stuff. There's an interesting way, I think, in which the approach to affordances might be looked at along those kind of like thin description, surface reading, limits of critique by removing by letting, but then it gets to the question of like, is it not critical, right? And this is a critical volume, right? It's a yes. Critical terms for yes, good. I do want to write a book someday on uncritical something. I would love to do. Do uncritical. Yeah, but anyway, so the question about affordances made me think of some of those points that you raise about thick description and thin description, and more recent work, which has generated a lot of both frustration and excitement around surface reading and the limits of critique. And that gets on to Marx and, Marxian analysis. I mean, in terms of my, I think in the material turn, it doesn't play a super important role. Jane Bennett engages a lot with Marx, but in a way that I think a lot of Marxists are not super happy with. I had an experience of this teaching her chapter on commodity fetishism and commodity enchantment and this was it wasn't at my university, but it was at a summer school that I was involved in for graduate students and I taught this piece. It was a seminar on magic, and two of the students, the visceral, they hated Jane Bennett's piece on commodity fetishism and enchantment because they thought that she was she was completely misreading Marx, and they could not countenance that she felt excitement at watching an ad for Gap jeans, right? Or no, not jeans, khakis, right? Because she opens that chapter with this the thrill of this is just kind of fun and enchanting and wondrous, and I want to dwell on that and their ethical possibilities in that. And these students who describe themselves as Marxists were I've never had two such angry students. It was really, really interesting. But so that's like as far as Marx gets in this stuff, really, I think, which some people would say is like not very far at all. But I mean, it does seem to me that the kind of the political, I mean, in as much as we can connect Marx with political economy, a lot of the stuff, like, I mean, Kadri Jain's work does a great job with that, actually. But it seems to me also relevant in the Marx who's talking about kind of species being and also thinking about our life, our vitality being put into what we create, right? That seems very, very relevant. So anyway, I'll stop there because there's, you want to say more at this point.
I guess I wondered about, this is connected to the affordances thing, like affordances versus concepts. I've been thinking, like, some of the language that I've been hearing throughout the panels today, not so much reading in the volume, but hearing the way people are talking. And even in the question that Sarah posed to us about moves, and we heard a lot about moves in the morning panel. I'm thinking about, like, the difference between a move and a turn. I mean, to some extent, this is just me riffing, but I do think that like a move, it indicates like something that you do in a situation. This is like a tactics versus strategy distinction, maybe. And affordance versus concept, similarly, is like an affordance does not close off future avenues, whereas a concept is like delimiting very clearly the concept. And like, I don't know that move can replace turn in the narration of the field, but a turn, doesn't have to imply the correct path, although I think it almost always does. And this goes to your point about overcorrection as well. I think we hear some overcorrection in the popularity of this trope of the turn, that whenever there's a turn, the idea that there would need to be another turn is like, let's get back on track. But the language of moves suggests to me like a kind of moving around, a kind of erring or turning that doesn't have to imply there wasn't a correct orthodox way to do things that we somehow got. We did too much language, we're doing too much culture, we have to stop, we have to do this other stuff instead. But I do think it matters the kinds of terms that we use to describe how our work is situated in relation to previous work imply something about its stakes, that I like getting away from the language that is implies like rigidity or total closure. And I've just noticed that we're hearing in different registers a kind of rhetorics of situatedness, I guess, is how I'd put it. Like a move is, a situated decision that you make in response to the exigencies of your position.
Can I invite you to turn a bit to talking about your audiences for each of your essays? You both were very explicit in your descriptions that you were interested primarily and especially in undergraduate students, which is, the target audience of the volume, but I think maybe the two of you have spoken more than any other presenters thus far about how you wrote with those people in mind. I have a sort of two-part question. One is, how does your specific term and the way you wrote about it in your mind sort of have an effect on how undergraduates might think about religion or the study of religion generally? And then what does the task of writing an essay like this and publishing a book like this mean for the field as we go forward, for those humans specifically?
I think, I guess two things. First, despite everything I've said, it's very clearly the case, and I did indicate this, that there's a point when what gets tagged as quote-unquote theory escapes containment and gets a little bit out of control in its like hegemony across way too many fields. I don't think the discourse itself is a problem, but the degree to which it exerted and determined the direction of discourse in the same way that the other turns do, I think was a problem. And one of the reasons I think it's a problem is not that I disagree with the content of the discourse, but precisely because it invites various kinds of affective responses that are that we could categorize broadly as the put off. I'm annoyed by it. I don't like it. It's too hard. I don't like what it made me think about. These are all totally normal responses to have to that kind of work. And I think it's a problem when like the ubiquitous tone of a discourse or a discipline is one that does not make you want to keep engaging with it. And that can happen when things get to a certain level of abstraction. So one of the things that I was very concerned with was I wanted to give students an anchor in this particular term, which is one of the sort of tags of that discourse. Like it's sort of, its most signal phrases, the text, textuality. Especially, again, used in contexts that don't have a philological text to speak of. And give them the tools to understand why that was happening, so that at least that term, which seemed to be bucking their common sense expectations of what text should be doing, would not be so alienating. Even if it was weird to them, they would at least know why it was happening. And I think that goes a long way toward making a discourse that seems forbiddingly abstruse actually turn out not to be. It's just that someone has to explain to you why it is the way it is, which again was my problem with my predecessor chapter, is that I just didn't see that happening. I forget what my second thing was, so I'll just leave.
I guess I'd add, I think for me it's giving the reader, in this case, an undergraduate or just like someone new to it, right? Something like, I don't want to say positive, but not negative, right? Something to kind of work with, and kind of build on, even if with a kind of critical eye or a bit of skepticism or questioning. And I think also just kind of, writing about cement and clay. I mean, blood is easier to connect. Mm-hmm. But cement and clay, thinking well, why would how is that religion? Right? So a little bit of surprise, or maybe to me, that's what makes a good essay. In this kind of text, where you're trying to reach a new audience, having a little bit of that surprise and just questioning the assumptions of why isn't he talking about church buildings or I don't know, whatever, right? Because it's not even about. I mean, I mean, I don't even think Kadri Jain. I mean, well, and I've talked to her a little bit about this. Like scholar of religion, yeah. I mean, yes, but no. Like, I don't think that's not how she would primarily identify herself, even though she's writing about gods a lot, right? She's interested in a lot more, and so that's why. I mean, it's one of the reasons I wanted to use her work. So again, showing that you don't have to, because even her interest in the kind of like statues of the images it's not like situated within a kind of like the tradition, right? And so that's what I wanted the reader to kind of come across, like, oh, this can count, right? We can learn something about religion or religiosity, via cement or clay.
One thing that I noticed reading the whole volume was you really learn that 3 examples is exactly the right amount for a 6,000 word chapter, because a lot of us are like, oh, here's my 3 examples. But one of the things that I really also noticed in the chapters that do treat multiple cases, such as yours, is that, and others that we've already heard about today, is that the comparative work that happens between case studies opens up an understanding of the term so clearly. Like, oh, I never would have thought of all 3 of those things as all being under the same category, but of course they are. It's matter. I mean, I would have thought that, but so it can be a new thought to somebody that those 3 things would make sense as belonging in one conversation. And like, again, like mine were like language as such, the Bible, and an ethnography. And like those 3 things all can in fact be treated under the heading of text in ways that inform each other, but somebody has to do that curating work, and like the constraints that were imposed on us by the format of the volume, I think led a lot of people to pick a number of case studies that do really interesting, informative work that way.
Yeah, it was also interesting to me, and you talk about Assad in your essay. I don't talk about Assad in my essay. I could have. Because his work is about, but it was interesting. Like Assad comes up a lot in this volume. I feel like, which was interesting.
Why is it interesting? Say more.
Well, I mean, okay. I mean, it's interesting because like he's clearly like I mean, I'm happy. He's an anthropologist, so I'm happy. Like but like it's. I mean, I guess well. He's getting a lot of traction. He still has a lot of traction.
Yeah,
right?
He's been around for a long time.
He's been around a long time, and his genealogies of religion and formations of secular are, still going really strong, right? I mean, so that I knew that, right? Because I see it in my department and my university. There's a lot of Assad, Columbia, but like it was just interesting to see, because this particular, I don't know. It was just interesting that because there was no like we didn't get any. No one said like make sure you cite. I mean, no, everyone had kind of free reign, right? I mean, Sarah didn't say anything. I mean, here's your term, and then just do it. And so that's kind of interesting to me. I mean, I haven't done like an analysis of who comes up the most, but
Assad comes up only twice in this edition, and it's only in 1 chapter. So Assad seems to have changed stature in the intervening years.
And that points us nicely to what you said earlier about everyone having to create a bibliography and a suggestion for reading. And I wonder if that's a place for us to think about, who are the people, what are the texts and ideas that are most salient in this volume compared to the last? And what does that suggest about if there's a 3rd edition? What are the points at which people want to go, so-and-so only cited twice. Who else is, there often, I think. I think we are about at time for Q&A. I have about 13 questions for you, and I'll hold them until there is
until we've run out of options here. So if there's anyone who would like to start.
I'm thinking about the Assad thing because I think it was probably sometime around 1998 when I was having a fight with a colleague in philosophy of religion who literally said to me, Talal Assad is illiterate. And I said, what? And he was so upset by Assad's critique of Geertz that he couldn't actually read or take in what was being articulated in the essay and the questions about power and the questions, very internal to the anthropology questions about symbolic anthropology, and then very, field-defining questions. So, I mean, I guess the comment is just that I think that when you have somebody like Assad who's doing something really new, it takes 25 years for people to figure out what he was talking about and put it to use. And I mean, obviously, it's been happening over the last 25 years, but I think that's one of the huge differences between 1998 and now is the influence of precisely that kind of work, which was literally illegible to at least people in philosophy of religion and probably many other fields in the 90s when it was being produced. So that's just comes up in relationship to that. And I was also really glad, Sam, that you brought up the bibliographies because I think they're one of the most important things in the book. The question I had was a question about, I think that I really also agreed, Sam, with your point about the language of moves being at best irritating, at worst pernicious, and precisely because they are creating what is seen as viable or not viable within the field for students working, people getting jobs, everything you said. And I think it's also, when Matthew, when you brought up surface reading, which I get hives when people talk about third grade, and uncritical reading, that felt so, I mean, on the one hand, I understand that work's coming out of a very particular English literature place where there's a certain version of Marxism from Jameson that people are rejecting. I mean, I know that, I get the context and the details, but I also think there's just this desire for the new. And in that sense, I think that we're all chasing some kind of, conception of novelty that's totally caught up in the market and in the political economy of the present in which we live. And I very much want the academy to at least work on a slow economic model, slow capitalism, at the very best. I mean, obviously we'd like to blow that up too, but it's the temporality of it. It's like everything has to change like this and having a turn. So I just wonder if in relationship to that question of what kind of power differentials come about when people have named a turn, other things become totally not salient, you're left behind. I mean, you've already been talking about this, so I'm asking you really just to maybe think a little bit more about, is there another vocabulary available to us? Is there a way to think about it in which we can question the value of novelty as an intellectual site? And if we do question the value of novelty, what kinds of things might we replace it with? What kinds of terms of value might we use and to talk about the importance of work without it being about this person says something brand new, which nobody ever is, right? So, okay, thank you.
Well, I mean, Sam, you when you talk about Assad in your essay, you mentioned the fact that that essay of the critique of Geertz, it came out in 1983, right? And it wasn't until so then the lead impact, really. So the book was 10 years later, but then so it's a long, I mean, in terms of the desire, the new, this is hard. I mean, yes, it's everything being new. And I mean, I made a point in having, in my suggested readings of having, and this doesn't go way back, but it was a little bit to Peter Brown's work from the early 80s and even before, he's thinking about stuff. I mean, not in the register, bones. I mean, when I read that, I thought it was absolutely amazing, right? And again, it wasn't in this material turn at all, right? But I think that this gets up against I mean, maybe we might be nearing the end, but
think the difficulty of pushing for that against the institutional and disciplinary strictures that demand newness, even though we all know, in terms of both publishing and in tenure, right? And like, you know, reading tenure letters and the expectations of universities for those letters and those dossiers to be like, this person it better be new, it better be and you know, and it's like you kind of and of course there's often that with peer review publishing as well, right? It's never ceased to amaze me how conservative even from, I think, like individual academics who would completely contest that was what they were doing, right? So now, you know, maybe the silver lining of things about to be dissolved is like, I'm not sure it's going to be built up on the right. I don't think the hill we're climbing now is the one we want to be on. But like anyway, so that's what it makes me think of. It's a tricky needle to thread.
I would just say quickly that there's a couple of places where that demand for novelty enters, and that it's not all through one aperture into the institution. And so I would just name like the commodification of undergraduate education itself is probably what I would call the leading cause of that, insofar as the stuff, I mean, what you can do with something like Rita Felsky is one question. Like that book, Limits of Critique, is one question. But another question is, why was that book even produced in the first place? And those are actually different. And I think the answers to the first one are very interesting, and the answers to the second one are very, very depressing. Which is, like, that's a book written in response to a perceived sense of irrelevance measured in enrollment. And that decline in enrollment also is articulated with, to go back to my bad affects thing, when you're paying that much money, do you really want to feel bad? I guess is the question. And I don't blame anyone who says no. If you're paying that much money, you should be having the best 4 years of your life. And almost nobody is. But you know, the idea that things should be hard is not like a problem. The idea that things shouldn't be hard is not a problem that's coming from students, although it's often blamed on them. It's coming from a variety of changes in the economic structure of the profession itself. So I don't think the demand for novelty can be gotten rid of unless we reorganize how education is delivered to people and wholesale. So which is to say, I don't think that we can solve that one. But I think that the demand for novelty is reaching a kind of fever pitch in these moments that are like, just concentrate on the immediate experience without thinking about a structure. That's when like not doing critique slides into actually just reifying the problem in the first place, which is not, again, what you can do with that book, but I do think that's where that book comes from.
They all pushed me forward, so you get to deal with my question. As I'm sitting here and reflecting on, I guess, this institutional analysis, I'm also curious, as textual scholars, when we think about looking at religion and its textualities, is there a point to which, or a series of tensions that we as scholars today are facing, and when it come in terms of trying to read and understand religion? Are there things unreadable about the, say, late modern context of religion that stand out to you?
Wait, can I ask you to explain one thing quickly? What do you mean by unreadable exactly?
But there's things are there aspects of our late modern culture that make religion either more or less difficult to interpret or understand?
I think it's difficult for me to answer that question because I'm just doing it myself in this late modern period. So like, yeah, but I tend to, I don't know. I want to say like, I don't know if it's any more or less difficult now than I don't want to kind of privilege the difficulty, so
that would be my answer. Yeah.
I think it goes back to the conversation we heard this morning about lice being something so ubiquitous it's very difficult to apprehend, whereas death, because it's an event that happens socially, you can apprehend it more clearly. I think, yeah, we're sort of swimming in the water, and so we're used to that water, and there are things that are hard to grasp about it. It's very hard when you're in the water to name the water as water, but I think one of the ways to think about what a critical term is like, this goes back to my point about the comparisons that a number of us are doing in our chapters, is that the point of a critical term is that it's a kind of lever that allows you to see something that maybe is very, very hard to get traction on, because you are located in the historical moment. And so like what's unreadable about religion in the late modern moment can become readable if you have the right critical term to sort of get a grasp on it, I guess. That's what I would say.
So I'm wondering about the way that you both answered that first question and the way that you would think about it kind of applied pedagogically. So like
Stop worrying.
more on the mic. Yeah. So the way that you kind of think about the way you answered that first question pedagogically, like on the one hand, like you were both speaking about like this need to be more attentive to like a political economy of the field that like is resisting this impulse to periodize and narrativize through this kind of like constructions of turns, because it have how it like forecloses a kind of like cross-pollination or pluralization theoretically. And on the other hand, kind of how do you think about kind of presenting the concerns and history of the field in such a way as to avoid, as you say, this kind of like being put off that an undergraduate or an entree into the field might experience as the primary audience that you're writing for. So like, I guess I'm wondering how you think about the relationship to disciplinary narrativization as a kind of pedagogical tool, given the fact that, like, as you gestured towards, at least, like you can't avoid the process of narrativizing in some sense if you're trying to think about a field as a field that can be kind of enclosed as something distinct. And so I guess I'm just kind of wondering how you think about kind of narrativizing in a responsible manner in some way if you're trying to teach people about what a field is, or if you're trying to avoid the periodization of turns. How do you kind of tell that kind of story as a narrative?
I guess by just trying to leave in the chapter like enough room for a reader to kind of take it elsewhere, just not circumscribe things too much. And again, maybe it's part of the motivation of kind of why I chose the three authors' works to focus on that I did. That I think none of them are like trumpeting like I'm part of the material turn kind of thing, right? Even so I think that's for me what to do. But it also gets, I guess I have the caveat. I use the churn stuff, and then I'm like, well, we can't, take this with a grain of salt and contextualize it. But I kind of just wish, I kind of wish I hadn't had to write that paragraph. I didn't want to. I wrote that paragraph because I had to, right? But I didn't really want to, this is kind of an ironic, like, disciplining of being anti-disciplinary, or like a foreclosed chance of being open. I don't know, like it's there's an irony in there, right? I guess because I'm not sure, but this maybe gets back to a question about like reading and how much you have to tell your reader how to read.
I mean, this is a pedagogical question, I guess, for me, in that when I'm teaching, and I only teach undergraduates, and I probably never will teach a graduate student, so I don't have to think about how I would like train graduate students, thank God. But no one's ever given me a rap to that, so I would have to figure it out from scratch. But I would have to, I just don't know what I would do to teach graduate students. You have to help them be prepared to be members of the profession in some way. And that has a different set of pedagogical demands, which again, I just have never been taught how to convey that. With undergraduates, which I did learn how to do, it's more like, can you apply a scholarly apparatus to an object well, successfully? Which is to say, like, I don't really care when I'm teaching whether my students are using up-to-date, the most current, like, theoretical frame. They have to choose a theoretical frame, and they have to have a rationale for why they've chosen it. But if it's, like, from the 80s, that's fine. I just want them to be able to execute the task of interpreting well. If they are, maybe if they're seniors in religious studies, then we might also want to have a conversation about where did that method come from? Why did it form the way it did? Why did it stop getting used? But as long as there's nothing like politically deeply problematic about the method, it's more about can you choose a frame with intention and apply it successfully? And that's what I like to see them doing in their work. And to that end, when I'm narrativizing the field, I am narrativizing the field in part to present an array of ways people have dealt with, in my case, texts. If a student wants to do philology with me, they can do philology, even though philology has a sort of air of fustiness in 18th century, 18th, 19th century antiquarianism about it, but it's a totally viable set of practices that are still live and being innovated upon today. So it's not really for me about we had philology and then we had this other thing and now you have to do a study in semiotic anthropology. But that here are the different things that text has done over time. You can choose any of them. If you want to then become professionalized in the field, then we would need to have a different conversation about why you're choosing the methods you're choosing. But that just doesn't really come up for me from my position as a teacher. Maybe for others it's different, but my experience as a teacher has not involved that. The need to make students very much in command of the discipline of religious studies as a whole field.
I'd like to step back from the title of this workshop today, from the future of the study of religion to simply the future of religion. Because I think there's a way in which in teaching, as you were just implying, if the question becomes that immediate question of the religious experience, the religious event, it takes on a kind of significance of decision for the student that then in turn can lead to the secondary literature of folks like us who study religion. And in particular, what we've talked about just now, the materiality of writing, the use or deployment of a text, the relation of text and audience, and what happens if we focus on the future of religion in the midst of those events. In the 16th century, prisoners like Sir Thomas More wrote to his daughter, Margaret Roper, in blood. And simultaneously, they talked about praying together simultaneously. At the same time, another prisoner who was about to be burned at the stake wrote to his mother and identified her with Sarah and said, "You've got to be like the mother who supports me as I am writing this letter to you. I'm including a prayer in the letter, and as soon as you've memorized it so that you can say it by memory and I can say it by memory, burn the letter." 3 weeks later, he was burned. The point that begins to emerge here is that writing in blood, memorializing the shared prayer, burning the text of the letter, but preserving that same letter in print to be circulated among all the people who could read it, raise a set of questions about the materiality of the audience and the building of that relationship between prisoners who are about to die, who are composing the last letter that she or he will ever write. What do I want to say? And then move to the questions of the linguistic and other turns of academic interpretation to give us a kind of sense not only of where these authors stood in relationship to their immediate circumstances, but how do we stand in relationship to that? And so my curiosity about the strategy of teaching is I'd like to hear a little more about the way in which the materiality of writing, how does students encounter that, learn from that? How do they develop a sophisticated sense of the urgency of the decisions of life and death of religious people within these contexts, and then move to the secondary but still important question of how do more recent writers, linguistic turn, because in one way, a huge turn in printing is occurring in the middle of the 16th century. Talk about a turn.
That's a revolution.
So it is a revolution, and it is a whole series of questions about what writing means and does for a vast number of people who had previously been people of speech, had been oral communicators, and now writing, and in this case the letter, becomes the medium. I think they need to grip the magnificent size of that issue and then move to the secondary interpretive strategies that we can use after they've engaged.
Thank you. Your reflections make me think of a lot. I think what in terms of the materiality of writing, I don't know. There's a lot in there, and I know we are. What time do we go to?
Do you have time to answer the question quickly?
To answer the question quickly. That's what I thought. No, it's okay. No. But there was so much in there. I'll just have to focus on one thing, and it's kind of moving out a little bit from what you were talking about. But it. I guess I'm worried about the. I mean, you're referring to some archives and sources of material to work with. I think one of the things, even though I'm not a historian, I think if I were, and sure this isn't a unique worry of today, but I worry about the future of archives and which are like, because people aren't writing letters on pieces of paper anymore. A lot of those are burned or lost or whatever, but God knows what's going to happen to my Google account, right? I mean, I'm not, and its accessibility, not, I mean, there's not much interesting in that because I don't really write I don't write, email is a form of writing which is kind of antithetical to depth. Mm-hmm. So, and letters, right? So I don't know. Sorry, that's not a full answer to what you were asking about. But when you talk about the materiality of writing, I think my worry is it's that its current materiality is not stable enough to my liking.
Yeah. I think I'll just say the magnitude of a technological change like print is very hard to appreciate. It's very easy to take the media that you grow up with for granted, even when media is changing very quickly. Even like you see, like between like when I teach like a fourth year student and then an incoming student, they have like different media that they are immersed in. And one thing that's very helpful about teaching about something like what happened when the Bible was subject to mechanical reproduction is that it enables them to understand that like the thing that they understand themselves to have outmoded was itself this like fundamental transformation in every sphere of life, including things like the apprehension of presence in the written word of God. That those kinds of things are you do have to have somebody teach you that those things weren't always there, that they had to be invented, and that when they were invented, things happened as a result. And that can then help you understand things like whatever new media forms religion is being mediated through now. Those were also invented at a certain point of time and had material effects that you might not be able to apprehend as such until you learn to think that way historically.
Please join me in thanking this panel for their work.